Dr. Alexander is a professor of religious studies at the University of California, Riverside, which happens to be the most economically and ethnically diverse campus in the UC system. At UCR, Dr. Alexander teaches classes on the religions of the world. He is also the author of Jazz Age Jews, winner of the National Jewish Book Award, which is the highest honor in the field of Jewish studies. We have been very lucky to count Dr. Alexander as a longtime friend and supporter of the Los Angeles Poverty Department. Tonight he will be speaking from his work in progress, Paths of Joy, Adventures in Religion and Therapy. The title of this evening's talk is The Great Thoroughfare, A Spiritual Adventure in the Time of Genghis Khan. So, please come up.
Thank you. Okay, good, the slides work. I wanted to, good. Thanks to Austin, we got everything up. I do want to thank Mindy and Henriette for this invitation. I've now been, through my wife Kathy, I've now been part of LAPD for close to 20 years. And I feel like, you know, this is something that I'm really very proud to be a part of, and especially this museum, because this is a community that deserves a museum. It has a history, and you know, what better than to have something right here in downtown as downtown is developing. So thank you, Mindy, for the invitation. Thank you, Henriette, for agreeing and allowing us to have a talk about religion. Henriette was at our home for Thanksgiving a couple of years ago, and at the moment that I suggested perhaps we could have a single prayer, I heard from the back of the room, "Oh, expletive." So I'm going to dedicate this talk to Henriette. The title of the talk is The Great Thoroughfare, a spiritual adventure from the time of Genghis Khan. It is from this forthcoming book, which is almost done. The story, a little bit of preparation before I start sort of reading from the manuscript. The story I'm about to tell you is a story about asceticism. And asceticism just means deprivation. It means being deprived of what you need. And I suspect that some people in this room know something about being deprived of what you need, your needs. You learn things when you're deprived of what you need. I should say what you think you need, because it's precisely deprivation which teaches you that the threshold, your threshold, the very bottom of what you think was the very lowest that you could go, that bottom is a lot lower than you thought. Some of you in this room have been there. Some of you know more than most people what the bottom can really be. And when you go through an ascetic period, you realize something incredible, which is that you can take it. You don't need anything the way that you thought you did. And also during an ascetic period, you realize something else about things or about wealth. And I think Master Lao said it best 2,000 years ago. To know you have enough is to be rich. That's the best definition of wealth. That's better than Adam Smith. That's better than Karl Marx. That is the best definition of wealth that I've come across. And that's a 2,000-year-old piece of Chinese wisdom from the Tao, the tradition of Taoism. To know that you already have enough, that's wealth. And I want to say one more thing before we get to the story about what happens with deprivation and asceticism. It's very special. Not a lot of people know this, but I think that some of you probably do. When someone is deprived like that, when one hits the bottom and manages to overcome, the soul grows. Master Cheng Chun, who we're about to meet in this talk, he wouldn't say the soul grows, he would say your spirit purifies. You go to that place that you never believed that you would see, and most of all, I think, having done some ascetic work, not by choice and not by necessity, but by choice, you go to a place, and I think that, at least for me, I found gratitude. One, I think, realizes that every morsel is a gift, every breath is a gift, every moment that we get to experience this funny world, this fouled up world, is a gift, and every day it's a gift to get up and to go out and to try to do better today than you did yesterday. That is what deprivation and asceticism teaches fundamentally, and once one learns it, the spirit can soar. So now I'm going to turn to our story and say a little bit about it. We're on the road to Uzbekistan and Afghanistan, and the year is 1221 AD. We are in the envoy of Cheng, who is a Taoist master from Beijing, which is here. He's actually from the town, he's from this peninsula of Shandong, which is here on the coast, but he's mainly up in Beijing. And the Emperor Genghis Khan would like to meet him. So the pronunciation that everyone uses, Genghis Khan, was introduced by Voltaire, but in Mongolian it's Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan wants to meet him. He's in Uzbekistan, so that's over here, just in Samarkand, which is just north of Afghanistan, so it's 4,000 miles away. He wants to, he's conquering the Middle East, but he's also 60 years old, and he's recently taken an arrow in his knee, and he's had a few horse riding accidents, and frankly, he's feeling old. And so he's heard that Master Chun over in Beijing is 300 years old, and he knows the secret to immortality. So Genghis Khan has ordered the old Taoist master to travel from the Pacific Ocean to Samarkand in Uzbekistan to teach His Majesty the secret inner alchemy that purifies the life essence and makes men into immortals. That's the story we're about to drop into. And now I'll begin to sort of read from the manuscript. The master steps out of his carriage into the freezing Gobi night. He's halfway through his journey, somewhere in the Gobi Altai Desert, straddling Mongolia in contemporary Xinjiang province in the furthest western corner of China. So he's actually right where the Google little indication of the mileage is. That's the area that he's in. It's a complete desert area between Mongolia, which is up here, and this furthest western portion of China. I think most reasonable people of the world would concede that this very spot constitutes the renowned middle of nowhere. The caravan has to travel at night. In daytime, the sterile desert can't be crossed. Yet it's the only way to get from Prince Temuga's camp in Mongolia, where Cheng has just been, down to the villages along the foothills of the Tian Shan Mountains leading into contemporary Kazakhstan, and from there a footpath will bring the group directly down a road into Samarkand to meet the Khan. But right now Cheng is in the desert, and it's dark, and it's freezing, and the caravan, including his own entourage of 19 disciples, they've all stopped for a little break. So what does he see in the heavens tonight? He sees stars like no place on earth. Maybe he sees a supermoon, a huge moon out. The desolate trail in the middle of nowhere hasn't yet become part of the Silk Road. Genghis Khan has only just become the undisputed emperor of that great thoroughfare. But this modest path will soon become the Mongolian fork going north of the Silk Road, as more merchants make the trip up to the Mongolian camps, which are becoming increasingly wealthy and influential as the empire is basically expanding from Beijing. Now it's going to Samarkand. Within 10 or 15 years, it's going to be in Budapest. It's the biggest land empire that the world's ever seen. The more ancient Silk Road that leads directly from Beijing to Samarkand would have been a much easier trip for Cheng, but the Khan's youngest brother, who was left behind in Mongolia to guard the homeland while the rest of the brothers were attacking Afghanistan, he had asked the Khan whether he might enjoy his own private lessons with Master Chun before the caravan would go all the way west, and the Khan had agreed. So Chun's caravan first traveled from Beijing 1,000 miles north to the prince's camp. Initially, the prince was extremely excited to meet the master, but he was soon disappointed to learn that lessons in the preservation of life needed to be preceded by a period of fasting. And the prince didn't like to fast. So initially, the prince said he would try to do this, but then every morning he would break the fast. And then a very heavy spring snow showed up, and it distracted him. And after a while, the prince changed his mind about getting the lessons at all, so the matter was dropped, and the caravan began its way across the mountains and the lowlands and the pine forests of Mongolia, and it was putting down the first tracks in what would soon become the new branch of the Silk Road as it was going. Chun has endured far worse than this. As a young man, a similar spirit overtook him when he realized he needed to leave the lazy coast of Shandong to find his own true way. Sources are sketchy about Cheng Chun's childhood, whether he was an illiterate orphan or whether in fact he was raised in a family with reasonable wealth. But at age 19, we do know he wandered into a local monastery on Mount Hanyu, apparently looking for something more than what life and position had allotted to him. And there in the monastery, he met a traveling mendicant, and a mendicant is a beggar. A middle-aged brute of a man with wild, charismatic eyes. The initiates called this old beggar lunatic. Actually, some of them called him drunk. But to be fair, lunatic's eccentricity could no longer be blamed on alcohol, which he'd given up. At one time, the peculiar monk had been the wine and liquor tax collector of his small town in a province in central China. Hagiographies say that he had taken the civil service and the military examinations to try to get up and improve his lot in life, but no excellent record of a career in either of those honorable vocations indicates that he passed the exams. And so lunatic soused his existential disappointments in the liquor that he taxed, and he neglected his family, until one day when he was tying one on in the saloon, or probably while he was on the job, a group of divine immortals crashed the place, and they demanded to take a drink from lunatic's own flask. That must have made an impression on him, because from that moment on he gave up drinking, and he gave up his job and his family, and he set out to find the way, with the Tao. And the Tao just means the way. I'm going to give you actually a little philology lesson here. So that's the top is the image of the Tao. This is a sub-character of a foot, and this is a character of a person's face, likely with hair on top, so that's a person. It's just the way a person goes is the Tao, the path. So lunatic left his home province, and a year later he settled in Nanshi village, where he built up a dirt pile about 10 feet high, and he dug out from the pile a vault. And then he lived in the vault, in the dirt vault. And he meditated, and inside that vault he perfected the inner alchemy. He called this earthen hermitage the Tomb of the Living Dead. And he put a sign on the door that says, "Here rests lunatic Wang." So that's how he got the name lunatic. He had no students, he took no visitors, he left the hut infrequently, only to beg, and after 3 years of solitude, textual study, sensory deprivation, fasting, and general drying out, his practice was perfected. He had realized the way. The immortals had even taught him the inner alchemy. He traveled to the more populated coast to find students, which is where Cheng Chun met his master, and half a dozen other disciples also came under the charismatic spell of lunatic and under the charisma of the mystery of the way. Lunatic Wang did not believe in coddling his students. One of the older disciples, Cheng Chun's colleague, was a man named Ma Yu. He was a rich man, he was a landowner, he had a prosperous business, and he had a lot of family connections in Shandong. He built a small monastery on his property for lunatic and the disciples, which they called the Hermitage of Complete Perfection, or Quan Zhen An. There, lunatic Wang and the group of 7 students conducted retreats in solitary confinement. A disciple would go into a hut for 100 days, and they would never leave it. And they would have their daily meal of rice delivered through a sunless window, and they would just sit there alone in the dark for 100 days and try to find the way. They also weren't given a lot of instructions. They were just thrown in there, go find it. A wealthy Ma Yu did those 100-day retreats, just as everybody else did. So did his well-to-do wife, Sun Bu'er, who was also a disciple. When lunatic said that all initiates had to be celibate, Ma Yu and Sun Bu'er divorced. One could ask the question why comfortable people would put themselves through such a strange hardship, but I think that people then were not that different from people now, and they did it for very similar reasons. They were missing something in their lives. They needed therapy. They suspected there was a more fundamental order of things, an order that might bring some meaning into their lives, and they would make onerous sacrifices to find them. Then one day lunatics sent the rich man Ma Yu out to beg into the streets. Lunatics smeared kind of rouge and makeup on Ma Yu's face, and he tied up his hair in the pigtails that was in the style of a child, and he sent him out to beg. And he commanded this community elder to go beg, especially from his extended family and from his ex-wife's in-laws. The humiliation was too much. Ma Yu, he loved his master. He'd paid for the Quanzhen hermitage. He didn't mind intense deprivation of any kind. He wished desperately to realize the way, but Ma Yu couldn't abide the humiliation of begging in a clown outfit, and he told his master he couldn't do it. And then he suggested sending somebody else out in his place. The lunatic responded by beating Ma Yu continuously over the course of the entire night. From dusk until dawn, Ma Yu endured random vicious blows from his master, his beloved teacher, and Cheng Chun himself had witnessed the harrowing episode. It was Cheng Chun who actually received Ma Yu's broken body the next day and attended to his wounds. And it was Cheng Chun who convinced Ma Yu not to flee from the hermitage. Hadn't lunatic chosen Ma Yu especially to receive private lessons in the inner alchemy? Cheng Chun reminded Ma Yu about the time that he caught the two of them, the master and Ma Yu, talking about the special rotation of the vital breath from the lower elixir field, now down near the navel, up to the upper elixir field, which is basically in the brainstem. He heard the master instructing Ma Yu how to allow his belly to rise and to fall, and then for his skull to bounce very gently on the tip of the skull as the breathing was happening. And as one rotated the breath up and down, in and out, in a kind of circle, up the spine, up through the spine, up and down. It was the secret teaching. It was the inner alchemy. Cheng Chun couldn't help but eavesdrop. Then once they spotted Cheng Chun listening, the two of the master and Ma Yu instantly shut up. Of the 7 students, obviously Ma Yu had been the only one that was deserving to receive the secret technique. And that's what must have been the reason that lunatic was so angry. That's what Cheng Chun said. The master wouldn't have wasted his time beating up a hopeless disciple. So Cheng Chun convinced Ma Yu that his realization of the way couldn't be that far off. So with Cheng Chun's personal encouragement, Ma Yu decided he was going to stay, and indeed shortly thereafter, Ma Yu became the first disciple of lunatic to actually realize the way. What is the way? What's the way? This is the question that was repeating in Cheng Chun's mind the whole time he was serving this lunatic Wang, to the point of making Cheng Chun absolutely crazy with frustration. Lunatic wouldn't tell him a single word about the inner alchemy as he told Ma Yu. Rather, for Cheng Chun, lunatic assigned him every conceivable privation and humiliation instead. Fasts, celibacy, isolation, poverty, sleep deprivation, and a daily agenda of excruciating and completely senseless tasks. Senseless tasks. Every morning, lunatic seemed to have a new task for him. Roll a boulder to the top of the hill, and then let it roll down, and then go do it again. That was one of the tasks for the day. Clean the pots and pans, then cover the pots and pans in pig excrement, and then go clean them again. Fill huge buckets of water from the well, lug them up to the hermitage, and then pour it into the ground. When it was snowing, lunatic had Cheng Chun sit right on top of the snowbank. When it was scorching, Cheng Chun was ordered to stand on one foot in the open sun for hours and hours. When it was beautiful, lunatic charged him with a day in the dark, solitary confinement. Lunatic seemed to make up these assignments randomly every single morning. Random, senseless tasks. How could this possibly be the way? Cheng Chun records that he even thought to himself silently, "Since the time I began to follow the master, I've been unable to understand what the way is. Everything that he has taught me or made me do had nothing to do with anything." And to explain himself, lunatic would only smack a student or kick him. And when feeling magnanimous, he might grunt. Though at other times, he might spurt out something from the ancient traditions. He liked Master Lao's Dao De Jing, which is the way in its power. He liked Master Zhuang's corpus, the Zhuangzi. And he also talked about a more recent book, the Qingjing Jing, the classic of clarity and stillness. But these scriptures hardly made any sense to young Cheng Chun. They certainly didn't make any sense out of the random sadism of his master. They didn't reveal any meaningful order of things. They never indicated what exactly the way is. They only spoke by negation, the way a teacher corrects a presumptuous student. No, that's not it. No, that's not it. No, that's not it. Master Lao, in fact, famously began the ancient treatise on the way with the impossible caveat that the way that can be told of is not the changeless way. So maybe the whole thing was inscrutable, or maybe it was a fraud. Now on this rocky desert road, a road so untraveled that it can just barely be called a road, Cheng Chun faces the impossible charge of explaining this ineffable mystery to the Emperor Genghis Khan himself. Maybe the conflation of the impossible road and the impossible charge reminds Cheng Chun of some verses that he studied in his youth about the making of roads. A road is made by people walking on it. Things are so because they're called so. What makes them so? Making them so makes them so. What makes them not so? Making them not so makes them not so. It hadn't made any sense at the time, back when Cheng Chun had studied these verses at the feet of lunatics. But now, 50 years later, as the master readies his old body to push himself back up into the carriage, once again to bump through the night toward the Tian Shan Mountains, and then to heaven knows where in Uzbekistan, now these verses speak something to him. In the end, he actually had received his realization and at the feet of the master. At Lunatic's deathbed, Cheng Chun had received his one last lesson. It wasn't much. In fact, Lunatic had revealed literally nothing at all. But these final empty words have allowed Cheng Chun just a glimmer of the way, and it was enough to keep him going all these years. Lunatic's disciples gathered around the dying master. Of the original 7, only 4 of them remained. They'd all been on the road back to Lunatic's home province to build a permanent monastery, but Lunatic had grown ill along the way, and on his final night, as Lunatic was about to ascend to immortality himself, he commanded Cheng Chun to follow Ma Yu as his new master, since Ma Yu had already acquired the way, while Cheng Chun had not. And then Lunatic turned to Cheng Chun directly, and he spoke his last words before he died. "You've committed one great sin which you must get rid of," he said to Cheng Chun. "In the past, you thought to yourself that everything that you had been taught had nothing to do with anything. You never understood that that which has nothing to do with anything is the way. As the caravan traverses its own abstruse way along this road that can only provisionally be called a road, Cheng Chun settles into his carriage, and he tries to clear his mind of thoughts. I make myself identical with the great thoroughfare. Such had been the great Master Zhuang's advice so many years and centuries ago." And that's it. All right. I made record time.
Would you like to take a couple of questions?
If anybody, if you have questions that I can answer, I'd be happy to answer, to take the questions, and if I can't answer them, I'd be less happy.
So, anybody want to know the meaning of life?
Yeah, so nothing on meaning of life. This is from a work in progress, Paths of Joy, Adventures in Religion and Therapy. I'm going to be going through the case of 4 religious geniuses, really, each of whom had a kind of a freak out, a real freak out in their lives, and by pushing through it, they ended up pushing themselves and the whole tradition forward. In this case, it was Genghis Khan who had a freak out. He's he's going to go, who are the four? One is Socrates at his trial. One is a Sufi by the name of Al-Ghazali, who was basically the top lawyer for the Sultan of Persia. And he was like the equivalent of the combined Supreme Court Justice and the Dean of Harvard Law School. And he was age 35, which is a pretty young guy. And suddenly, the Sultan is assassinated, and the entire politics, the whole world turns on end. And he freaks out, and he decides he's going to learn about Sufism, and he takes off to Damascus and sort of learns the Muslim interior alchemy in its own way. Then Chun, and then finally a chapter on a woman named Ferenczi who started a girls' orphanage in Venice in the 1500s, and was called into the Inquisition saying you shouldn't be doing that. And she said, yeah, no, I should be doing this. So that's the fourth case.
What happens to Genghis Khan?
Genghis Khan, well, you got to read the book. That's not okay. That's like a spoiler. He dies. He dies in 1227 while fighting the Tanguts in central China. He kicks a little ass in Afghanistan. That happens. He didn't have too much trouble in Afghanistan. And he genuinely becomes very curious in the way. I'm not sure that he became celibate. He had 500 wives and concubines, but yeah.
500.
Walter, please.
Yeah, I think it's so cool and awesome that you're doing this jazz thing. Tell me about what got you interested in Jewish jazz musicians, in that, you know, in the early 20s and 30s, I think the Jewish clubs, I think, were the only places that allowed black musicians to play. So there's a really rich history in that. What got you? What made you want to get involved in writing about that?
So that was my first book. It's called Jazz Age Jews, and yes, indeed, it was about how that early generation in the 1910s and 20s of these Jews who had been born on dirt roads in Lithuania came over to the United States with Yiddish accents and somehow decided that African American music was the real American music, and that's what they wanted to learn. And the book was trying to explore, why did they make that decision? Why were they identifying with the most marginalized group in America as opposed to identifying with the aristocrats or something like that? The reason that I came, and I will give you the spoiler because the book's old. The reason that I came up with is that Jews had that very place in society in Europe. They had the exclusion. The principle of exclusion in Europe had been religion, and Jews were the outcast group. The principle of exclusion in the United States had been race, and specifically enslaved race. And so when Jews came to the United States, they saw that another group basically held the place in the social order that they had held while they had been back in Europe. And they started to identify with that group as being like themselves. And they started to play the music and really feel the music. I mean, anybody who knows Benny Goodman or even George Gershwin knows that these guys could swing. They were not faking it. The one thing that they didn't realize or articulate very well, some of them did it better than others, is that in the United States they did have a white privilege, which means the very fact that they had white skin didn't allow them to really play this. They couldn't imagine themselves as marginalized the way that the African Americans were. And so there's tension arises in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s over this kind of confusion and into identity, which is, Jews sometimes saying to African Americans, we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps, why can't you do it? And the answer is because you're white, right? So it's a complicated history in the 20th century, but I think that it comes out of, not out of malice, but it comes out of genuine identification of Jewish immigrants with African American life. It's a complicated and an important tradition, but if you think about the great masterpieces of the 20th century, you know, Porgy and Bess, or even Elvis's Sun Sessions, or even Eminem. It's white people looking at African American music, really identifying with it, and not quite realizing that, you know, it's not quite yours. So that's another topic, maybe for another salon.
And the name of the book?
That's called Jazz Age Jazz.
And we can find that where?
Well, it's on Amazon. I don't think it's on Kindle. It's kind of
Amazon.
dated. It came out in 2001. I'll get you a copy, Walter.
Okay.
No, Dad, I think it is on Kindle.
It's not on Kindle.
I checked.
She checked.
It might not be, but I think it is.
Thanks.
Please.
What are the original materials that tell you the stories that you just told us?
There are some great materials. So the Chun's first disciple makes an account. He writes an account that was translated by the great Orientalist of the 20th century, Arthur Whaley, in the 1930s. It was still his translation of the Dao De Jing is like the standard. He made a translation of the travelogue, which is available on Amazon. You can get a copy of it. So that's one of the sources. But then there are other sources, which is that a lot of the writings of Cheng Chun, what happened to Cheng Chun later is that he became such a rock star for having met Genghis Khan that when he goes back to Beijing, he becomes a huge celebrity, and he basically Taoism becomes an enormously popular religion. And so all of his writings are preserved, all of his lectures are preserved, a lot of his thoughts are preserved, so it's all there. I read some classical Chinese. I really leaned on my colleagues for help. And I do, I'm doing, the work I'm doing is a little bit ecumenical, so a real drawback of it is that I can't work in the languages the way that I can for my own Yiddish and Hebrew and Aramaic. But I feel that the work is important enough that, and that people are similar enough that you can sort of, you can try to tell the story. And the scholarship surrounding Genghis Khan is fantastic. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm still thinking about the last quote that you had up on the slide.
Go back.
And I'm hoping that I didn't miss this, or the last two quotes, I guess, really. What is your interpretation of them?
Thank you.
Well, I think it's a realist religion. It's a realist religion. The world is senseless. And now you have to figure out how to make peace with the reality of the world. That's what I think it means. It's a to me, I love Taoism. It is so good. And the more you read it, the Tao Te Ching or the Chuang-Tzu, and a lot of those documents, but those two in particular, I mean, the philosophy it's poetic, but it's also extremely rigorous. It's like it's trying to figure out how to say something about a world that's essentially chaotic, that you essentially can't say anything about. It's beautiful. So that's my sense of what that means. Yeah. Yeah.
If you don't mind speaking personally, what are the things that you tried, the deprivations that you
light
what
stuff.
were your reactions in exercise?
Well, it's kind of fascinating that in the 10th and 11th centuries, both in China and in Persia and Damascus, and in other places, people start to become very interested in how to explore phenomenal reality, by which I mean is what is your experience of life? What is the experience like? And they do this by trying to simplify as much of the sensory world that we have and bring it in a little bit. So this is, these meditation techniques. So Al-Ghazali, he sits in a room and he says the name Allah over and over and over again for 8 hours a day. That's what his Sufi tradition was. And Cheng Chun they're doing a number of different things, but the most basic thing they're doing is watch your breath in the navel as it expands. Have a little bit of intentionality of kind of thinking about drawing it up through your spine to the tip of your head. Then make sure that your tongue is on the roof of your mouth. I hope I'm not giving away any big secrets here, but make sure your tongue is on the roof of your mouth so you can kind of make a bridge between the cleft of your mouth and the front of your body, and then have the breath come down again, and just have this cycle, and feel the cycle and experience the cycle. So you're trying to sort of cut out a lot of the world. You can't cut out all of it. And getting in that zone, first of all, first and foremost, you start to sort of see reality for what you sort of have a real, you see reality for what it is, the phenomenal experience of it. And you get to see the components of it very clearly. So in a world that's sort of typically sounds and visuals and interior feelings, you sort of are able to kind of parse them out a little bit. And have a clearer sense of what reality looks like. And then sort of the opinion of Taoism is that is ultimately a very chaotic reality that exists. The things that we think are stable, ourselves, what we see, the things that we hear, are actually, once you get in there and really look at them, are a lot less stable than you think. And that was my own experiences in any kind of meditation that I've done. And I think it is worth it to check it out. It's just another kind of exploration. Yeah.
I was curious why you used the word therapy, since you were talking about older traditions.
Well, because I think that religions are the realm in which people are the therapeutic traditions. It's the therapy that people had before there was modern therapy. It's the place that you went when you weren't feeling right about your world and you wanted to figure out, how do I make it right? Now, they did have, all these traditions have metaphysical elements that sort of were part of the healing process, which is maybe if you believe something, then you'll feel healed again. But a lot of them don't. Or a lot of them you're able to, or even they themselves were able to sort of bracket those metaphysical questions about the hereafter, or whatever they might be, and say, no, there's things that you can do right in the here and now that are going to help orient you and help you make peace with the senseless world, in this case. And these are the wisdom troves of therapy before the modern era, before it became scientific, before one needed quantitative experiments in order to sort of determine whether or not things were true or not. But the truth is that people have been doing internal experiments on themselves now for thousands of years, and there's a lot of wisdom there that science is not going to catch up with too soon. I mean, eventually people will do the quantitative experiments about meditation and this and that, but until then, you can still look in the Lao Tzu and find stuff that's useful. That's why I use the word, and that's why I think about it that way. Yeah.
No, he had a question.
Maybe we just have time for one more question?
Whatever you want. So Walter went. Did somebody else? You can talk to me afterwards if there was. Is there another question, or is Walter going to clear it up?
I had one, but it was kind of answered by this lady
We can talk outside then, or can you call on?
Yeah, no, we can absolutely continue the conversation more informally, but we can also open up the floor for another one. If you wanna, okay, because we have so much food, guys. We have so much
One more thing. Thank you for the opportunity to present this work for the first time here at the Skid Row History Museum.
Yeah. Come on, let's give it up. Let's give it up.
Yeah, so please go outside, grab a bunch of food, and then band's gonna sit up and.